Okay, I've got something. It is working. Will this show up here now? It does show up here. Good, good, good. Get shareable link. Alright, well, test. Yep, not too much latency there. Okay, well, that's 3:45. Hello, welcome all. As I'm sure most people will be watching this later, this is technically a live stream, but just because this is the easiest way for me to record a video. This is a 7-point Highlander data deep dive for those who like their mathematics. I'm not going to promise to be an expert on literally everything, but some time ago when the spreadsheets and everything were first getting revamped, I thought, you know what, I might try my hand at this. And while there's been a lot of content out there, I've just been sitting on a little bit of, just looking in the background. And so I just thought I'd share all of my thoughts in the lead up to CanCon about how the format's going so far. All right, well, without any further ado, let's get into it. Oh, I am Mouse, member of the Points Committee. Hopefully people might know who I am, but if you don't, hello. All right, let's get into it. The first thing I'd like to say before I get into the content necessarily is just thank you to all of these people. Without these people, there is just no chance that a video like this would be possible. So if you're out there and you watch this, well, great. Pat, GG's, Plenty of Games. These are the people and / organisations who put on the tournaments. And without these tournaments, we wouldn't have any data to talk about. And indeed, these tournaments are great for playing 7-point Highlander. So thank you to you guys. Volti, fellow committee member, countless hours of data input. When the spreadsheet, and this kind of dovetails onto Graham and the original spreadsheet team, when the spreadsheets really took off, there was a bit of a revamping of them, reformatting, looking at more data analytics, and Volti and I kind of worked in parallel. Volti working on a lot of the conversion factor stuff, and I was working on like the match point average stuff. And she's just been great in terms of pumping out all of the content and really like making sure there's a much more of a media ecosystem around 7 Point Highlander, Highlander, the format. And without all of the work she put in the deck list, I just wouldn't have been able to do this video. So thank you. And thanks for Graham and the original spreadsheet team from way back when for getting us started on this. So a shout out to Angus. Macro types are a thing which I use a lot in this video, and I got that idea from one of his videos, so big thumbs up there. Ben Simmons, fellow Wollongong player, collaborated with me on the null hypothesis testing later on. Definitely was a piece of the puzzle which I needed. And lastly, my wife Michaela, who's much better at statistics than I am, and that she engaged with me in many conversations to make sure that I wasn't just making stuff up out of nothing. All right, onto the video in substance. Table of contents. What I'm hoping to cover in this video is the following points. 1, is it worth doing any data analysis, period? 2, what is format health? 3, and this is where the majority of the video is going to be, is measures. So we'll talk about that in more detail later, but I'm going to be talking about archetype diversity, deck diversity, game diversity, and accessibility. Unfortunately, I don't have really enough time to talk about accessibility in this video, but the reason these are the 4 things I'm trying to measure is that this is the mission statement of the 7 Point Highlander format of the committee. And so I think that if we're going to ask the question, how is the format going, we should be referring to how is it going with reference to the thing we are trying to fulfill, which is the mission statement. And then I'll be concluding with some further thoughts. Okay, so first thing I want to address is it worth doing any data analysis, period? The reason I want to talk about this is that I feel like when I read Public Points discussion and other different, forums within the 7 Point Highlander Discord, the prevailing community sentiment seems to be, quote unquote, there isn't enough data. And this is just a collection of anonymized quotes from people in the Discord, no particular shout outs. I'm not trying to be mean or rude or anything, but I'm just trying to demonstrate here that it seems to be the received wisdom in the community that people think that there just isn't enough data to do any actual statistical analysis. And I don't actually think that's true. I feel like people might not really have a good perspective on actually just how little data a lot of stats analysis is done. Like, a lot of psychology, for example, which does a lot of statistical analysis, it's very hard to get very large sample sizes, and so there are actually a lot of tools to draw quite reasonable conclusions from small pools of data, and I think we can use those tools. So for example, this is just something I might teach in a maths lesson, but let's just imagine that I flipped 4 coins and I was counting how many heads there were, and I did this 10 times. So this is just like from a website. I just flipped 4 coins. I did it 10 times. And I made a little frequency table. Hopefully, you might be able to see that the curve is already looking kind of normal. And 10's not really a big number in the grand scheme of things. But if you run a little central limit theorem test here for a binomial, you'll find it's not normal. But you add 10 more, and suddenly it is. There is a statistically valid test which you can use for a binomial distribution. And according to this, 20 is enough to deliver something which we could say is normal and therefore make some basic statistical inferences. And if you look at the sort of numbers we're getting in terms of cards played in 7 Point Highlander matches, the number is much bigger than 20. There are, especially mental misstep, there are a lot of cards which see a lot of play, and across a bunch of different tournaments too. And so that's just to say, I think that we can use a few basic statistical tools. I think that we can make a few inferences from them. I'm not saying we can make any grand definitive claims of solving the format, quote unquote, with data, but I think that the community wisdom of there just isn't enough data to do anything is wrong, at least in my opinion. So now that I think it's worth actually making the video because there is enough data, let's go into talking about it. So here's what I want to try and solve in this video. What is format health? So it's in the mission statement. The 5 elements are fun, archetype diversity, deck diversity, game diversity, and accessibility. I'll just asterisk fun and accessibility here. The reason I'm not going to have a fun measure is because it's kind of assumed that fun is like the derivative achievement of achieving the other things. Like that if the format is diverse enough in archetypes and decks and games. That is to say that when you rock up to a 7-point Highlander tournament, you play against a bunch of different players doing different things, and the games feel different and unique. That is the fun of the format, right? So I'm just going to assume that if the other three are achieved, that fun is achieved. The accessibility, the reason which I can't really go into that in this detail is this video is already going to be pretty long, and I didn't have the time to go through and tag decks as 8-point and not 8-point. But look, I'll just say that, like, you know, I've seen a bunch of really cool 8-point decks. You know, I lost to an 8-point deck in a final of a tournament recently. It was just a totally unique deck. It was one of a kind in the room. It seems to me that 8-point has a room in the format. It's able to be successful, and so in my mind, at least, without using any data, it feels like that goal has been achieved. So onwards to the next three, which I feel like I can comment on with a bit more intelligence. So the first question is, what is a measure? So when you say something like, does the format have macro type diversity or archetype diversity or something like that? Oh yeah, Henry's in the chat. Yes, it absolutely was. Yeah, so if you say, does the format have diversity, you should have some sort of like a priori metric for what diversity means in a format. And what I mean by that is to say, before you even look at any data, you should have some idea of what you'd expect. So what I've said here for archetype diversity and game diversity is that there is really no other choice than code and counting. So code and count is a qualitative analysis tool where you essentially go through and you've got a bunch of different, you know, traditionally it's like interviews or client statements or something which isn't reducible to a number, and then you have some sort of like team or you know, qualified person code these into groups and then count how many is in each group. So all I'm doing here is I'm looking at decks, you know, and I'm saying, what are the different groups I can cluster these decks into, and then I can ask myself how many in each group there are. And then after that, I feel like the best way, and the measure which I chose to embark on, is to just run like a probability statement, like in your average 7-round major tournament, what is the probability that a person faces all unique archetypes or faces an archetype no more than once or something like that. So you know, as long as I make a probability statement like that that feels like it is reflective of a good tournament, I feel like that's a good measure for archetype. So the one I chose was, what is the probability that a random player will encounter the same archetype more than once in a 7 rounds? So, sorry, hang on, no, that wasn't the one I chose, but that's just an example. So deck diversity, same deal, you can code and count, but this time, when I'm talking about deck diversity, instead of talking about archetypes, I'm going to be talking about this concept called macro types. So the idea here being like, if say you face control 3 times in a row, but one of the control decks is Blue Moon, one of the control decks is like a Jeskai control, and one of the control decks is like a Grixis control, that would feel in my mind more diverse than just facing Blue Moon 3 times. So there has to be some sort of metric that about like the rate in which players encounter the same, not just the same archetype, but the same decks within each archetype. So an example might be, given that a player encounters the same archetype more than once, what's the probability they encounter the same one? I'll go into more detail soon. I'm just giving an idea of what a measure is. Game diversity is a lot more different, because what game diversity is implying is that even though you might play against different archetypes and indeed even different decks, if all of those are playing the same broadly powerful tools, then the games might feel similar. So example of this would be like combo decks are likely to lead off with like Turn 1 Inquisition of Kozilek or Thoughtseize, as might a Grixis control deck, as might like Jund. And if every single deck with black in it ends up playing Baragoi or Thoughtseize or something like that, maybe that's not a desirable thing. So when we're talking about game diversity, I'm going to be looking at a more like numerical, quantitative approach about the strength of individual cards, with the assumption that if a card overperforms, that different decks in different archetypes and different macro types are going to feel obligated to play it. So we should desire cards not to overperform, and we'll get into how we're going to define overperformance later. But that's generally speaking my discussion of, we need measures. We can't just like look at spreadsheets and say, do the numbers look good? In my mind, what we should be doing is we should be trying to predefine what success looks like and then seeing if we meet that. So let's go on to some is other things. So the first one thing, you know, which is also good practice, is to say, if you're going to do what I've done and come out with a video and all these different discussions, you should probably have some reason to do it as to why we feel like the current measures aren't quite satisfactory. So I'm not trying to take any shots here. I'm just saying why, like, personally, I was not satisfied with using any of these measures. Even though, for example, match point average, like, you know, I played a big part in making this one a thing, but ultimately why I wasn't satisfied with it. So let's get started. So the reason I don't like conversion factor as a metric for evaluating, reason I don't like conversion factor as a way to evaluate success is because tournaments have different sizes, but the conversion factor will always be taking like top 8, or if you do like you know, Volty's idea of doing the winning deck, which is I think a good improvement of taking, for example, the top 16, is that the top 8 or top 16 will always be a different relative percentage depending on the size of the tournament. Like top 8 in an 80 player tournament is different to top 8 in a 110 player tournament. So if I'm going to compare tournament to tournament, I want to pick a measure which, it doesn't matter how big the tournament is, I can still use the same measure to get a bit of cross-tournament comparison. So that's why I don't like, that I didn't end up using conversion factor. The reason why I didn't end up using match point average was that I'm not actually convinced that a draw is a reliable indicator of relative power or strength of a deck or card compared to a loss, because people draw for many different reasons. Like, if people just play slowly, but one deck was definitely winning at the end and it went to time, like, that doesn't really tell me, like, the losing deck isn't better than a player who just lost in a timely manner, you know? So I'm not convinced that drawing is really a reliable indicator of strength. And additionally, in order to perform a binomial central limit theorem test, I need a binomial data set, which is just to say I need a data set with 2 outcomes, like win or lose, rather than win, loss, draw. So that's why I wasn't a fan of using match point average in the end. For the qualitative stuff, why I didn't end up using the archetype wheel, which is the most common way which we distribute the archetypes in the 7-point Highlander community. And the reason for that is that in my mind, there are too many fundamentally different decks grouped into the same archetype. So, for example, you know, control contains both like Jeskai control decks, but also bots is commonly is commonly lumped in. So apparently the camera's obscuring some text. Thank you for the feedback, guys, by the way. But also bots is sometimes lumped in as a control deck. And I just feel like, for example, if someone was to say, oh, this tournament was rubbish, like I just played control all day, the person who says that is likely not, the person who hears that is likely not thinking, oh, they played, you know, bots half the time and then some Eldrazi and some control. Like I feel like when people say I played this over and over and over again, that this has to have something in common with each other. So I have my own spread of archetypes, which of course has its own relative strength and merits, but that's why I just didn't use the one we already have. And the reason I didn't tend to use sectographs or pie charts, although you will see some of them, but why I didn't use them to do any quote-unquote analysis is that I don't think the flat numbers and percentages do enough to inform people about format health. So for example, if someone says like, look, this tournament was really boring for me because I basically just played like control and aggro all day, right? So, or let's say aggro and mid-range all day. That's probably a bit more a contemporary example for 7-point. You know, all I did was aggro and mid-range, aggro and mid-range. If you look at a graph and aggro and mid-range represent like, you know, 33% each, but then there's a lot of other decks occupying the last, you know, 33%, it's not really clear if that means the format's good or bad. Like, I feel like rather what we should be doing is we should be having some sort of you know, positive tournament experience defined, and then just calculating the probability that that tournament experience happens. I think it's cold comfort to say to someone, well, you might not have had a good time, but the graph looks like it's pretty even. So yeah, I'm not using the graphs for that reason. So anyway, that's just why I'm not using the measures we already use. I think I'm using some unique measures, and hopefully they add value. So anyway, let's keep going. Okay, so archetype and macrotype diversity. So I'm just going to talk about archetype diversity right now, and I'm aware that the camera thing is not brilliant, but anyway, we'll just power on ahead. There we go. Let's see if that's any better. Okay, it's okay. I think it's okay to face the same archetype more than once in a tournament. Like if someone says I face control twice, or I face mid range twice, I think that's okay. As long as maybe like the decks within them are sufficiently different. So for example, if someone said like half, you know, I faced 3 aggro decks, but the aggro decks were like burn, prowess, and initiative, I feel like that player will have that as like, I played 3 different decks. And likewise, facing different combo decks, I think is still going to feel a little bit more satisfying. However, there is still probably some upper limit. Like, for example, we don't want to turn into CDH, where everyone's playing against a different deck, but literally every deck is combo, right? It's just like depending on which combo you're playing. So I feel like, and for this is just an a priori measure I invented, which I'm looking for feedback at the end if people disagree with this. I think that the upper limit should probably be no more than half. So we should want basically less than half of someone's tournaments to be against the same archetype, right? It's okay to face mid-range 3 times, as long as your 4 other games are not mid-range. I don't think that player is likely to say, I faced nothing but mid-range. But maybe if their tournament was more than half mid-range, yeah, they might feel a bit jaded at the end. And so, the measure I've decided on for archetype health is what is the probability that a player faces a single archetype no more than half their tournament. That's what I've decided on doing. Now, how did I go about calculating this? Let's see if I've got this right. So, what I'm aiming for is the vast majority of players, so 90% plus players, to encounter the same archetype a maximum of 3 times. It's theoretically possible to do this with combinatorics, but it's a really rancid maths problem. Like, it would take me days of writing out all the individual things. Like, it's well beyond the syllabus which I'm used to teaching, that's for sure. However, what we can do instead, which is the kind of quick and dirty way to do it, if I generate like a few thousand samples of a tournament based on the data sets of the tournaments we have, I can just see what percentage of the match selections pass the test and see what the result is. So anyway, that's what we did. So what I've got here, and I'll do my best to explain basically what this is that these are the samples, right? And here, imagine that for this one, this is the RC, right? So this is the RC. There's 112 decks, and so I just group them into archetypes. Like the first 29 decks are archetype 1, and first 31 decks are archetype 1, and then the next two, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 decks are archetype 2, etc. I just generate random numbers between 1 and 112, so that's like you're facing one of the 112 decks. I convert those into their grouped archetype. I count how many times a single tournament in like a single player would encounter each of the 8 archetypes I've defined, and then I just test if any of these numbers are bigger than 3. So if they're bigger than 3, that means that this player, like this might be sample 1, a player at a tournament, faced the same archetype more than 3 times. So this random player encountered, let's say, aggro once, combo twice, control twice, and big mana twice. I'm saying that's a positive experience. Whereas if I find one which failed, like this one, this player faced aggro 4 times and mid-range twice. I'm saying that's a negative play experience. So that's how I've defined passing and failing, and then you just look at the pass rate here, and I just press delete a bunch of times, so every time I do this I'm generating 300 more samples, and what you can see is that pretty consistently we're getting over 90. So from an archetype perspective, the RC is passing because most players, or the vast majority of players, will not encounter the same archetype twice. Now, you might ask, well, Ben, Mouse, what have you said is an archetype? And good question. So let me talk about how I define the archetypes, so to give you guys an idea. So I have 8 archetypes I think exist. The first one is aggro, and in this you can get a bit of an idea looking at these small things before what I put in there, but it's decks which basically try to kill you quickly, right? Like, they're not interested in the game going for a grind. The mindset of someone playing against aggro should be either survive or kill them faster. There's no really other choice. So like, initiative decks tend to do this, decks with just lots of small dudes, decks which are very all in on like infect or prowess tend to do this, stompy decks tend to do this. The next archetype I've got is control. So these are decks which on the opposite end try to make the game go for as long as possible. Like, you don't lose the game because your life total goes to 0, you lose the game because your top deck and your opponent shows you they have 7 counter spells in their hand or something like that. Right? So in there I've got Blue Moon and Jeskai with the control decks present. The next one I've got is mid-range. These decks tend to try and play just like very efficient, powerful threats, which is, they try to basically slow down the early game, control the middle of the game, and then end it before anything too silly can happen in the late game. They've got a very middle of the road strategy, so to say. So yeah, you'll see a lot of decks with a lot of 3 drops are in this category. Okay, combo. So I feel like we kind of know what combos are. They're trying to do something unfair by assembling cards, like one, two or three cards which work together in a like nearly instantly game-ending way. Tempo. This is like mostly what I call like protect the queen type strategies. These are decks which try to win with 1 or 2 threats which are very well protected, and they're winning the game. They're trying to make the opponent stumble, you know, so that the game ends before their opponent had a chance to really make their strategy work. Big mana is pretty much bots and Eldrazi. If there was like a Primeval Titan ramp deck, I guess I'd put this here as well. But these are decks which are trying to play above power curve cards by investing the early game into generating large amounts of mana. So bots and Eldrazi in mine are here. Like these are decks which play the 7 and 8 drops, and they're not powerful because they're powerful cards. They're powerful because they cost 7 and 8, and these decks play the cards necessary to meet those mana costs. The next one I've got is, this is probably the I don't know if people recognize this as an archetype, but it is in my mind, is synergy/engine decks. So these are decks which tend to play the most totally unique cards, as in they're playing a lot of cards which would not fit in anyone else's deck because they just are not powerful enough standalone. But if you get but there tends to be like 5 cards where if you get 3 of any of them, they start to do something which doesn't win the game instantly, but generates like value over time, which is hard to overcome. So in this I have like tokens decks, right? Anthems and subpar dudes which create wide bodies. Lands, you know, like it's the Crucible's not that good, the Strip Mine's not that good, and you know, like the Rumming Up Excavator or the Exploration's not that good, but if you have them together, it's not like the game's over, but you know, you start to generate an engine. Goblins is kind of like this, right? Like no one main decks these goblins. They work well because they work together, like Thop the Sword and Flickery decks. You know, these are synergy engine decks. And lastly, I've got mid-combo hybrid, which I actually, after doing this, really, I just call this hybrid combo now. These, to me, have a totally unique play pattern because they're not like combo decks where they're explicitly out there to protect the combo. The way these decks win is that they present an unignorable plan A, like either it's mid-range or tempo or something, and then they take advantage of the turns your opponent spends dealing with plan A to then slip the combo in and kill you. So you know, you're facing Walks, you've killed the territorial Karvu, the Morlock ate your dude, the Fable of the Mirror Breaker's down or something, and you've just tapped out to like Pyroglyph and kill their biggest threat, and then they untap and Spellseeker you or something, right? Like they didn't win by going Inquisition, Thoughtseize, play Spellseeker with 5 counterspells backup. They won because they made you ponder for cards or you know, invest your resources killing their plan A, and then the combo killed you. So this are the archetypes I define, but for the purpose of the video, when I group them up, when I group the archetypes up by this and run my little sampling thing, nobody faced more than one, or very few people, only 10% of people were likely to face these archetypes more than 3 times. So the most they would face an aggro deck would be 3, 90% of the time. Now, that said, there are of course limitations, and we should acknowledge the limitations. So for example, if an archetype is systemically more or less powerful than another archetype, then you would expect a divergence in the tournament such that the top half of the tournament would contain more of the successful archetype and the bottom of the unsuccessfuls. So it means that the further onto the tournament you get, the less likely that 90% figure is to hold, but at least it's a good ceiling to come down from, if that makes sense. Now I think that I also have, so before I do that, I also have archetype, the same thing from the Pog Winner library. So this is the same, you know, basically the same thing, the same categories. I once again ran the samples, and we have a pass. It's actually gone down a little bit. These numbers, if you can see them here, are more oscillating between like 88 and 91. So the average of the numbers is less than the RC, but having said that, it's like 3%. This kind of strikes me as like margin of error, or maybe just like Melbourne meta. It has gone down, but not enough for me to be concerned. So the conclusion of this section would be, I think that both before the pointing, most recent pointing, and after the pointing, the format was doing a good job in terms of archetype diversity. Now let's talk about macro type diversity. So macro type diversity is to say this: in an ideal world, in an absolutely ideal world, you'd want every single game to be against a different macro type, which means you'll feel like you're going to face a different deck every time. So I'll give a bit of color as to what a macro type is. So if I go back to my little code and count thing here. So if you're going to face aggro 3 times, you would rather it be once against initiative, 1 against stompy, and once against prowess, or like an all-in, versus 3 initiative decks, right? Like it would be a more positive tournament experience to have a spread inside this archetype. Or, you know, if you're going to face control, you'd rather be once against Blue Moon and once against Jeskai than twice against both. If you wanted to face combo, you know, multiple times, you'd rather it be different combo decks, so it doesn't feel like you're just doing a rinse repeat of all of your rounds. So that's what I mean by macro type diversity, that when you face the same archetype, you'd want it to be different every time. Now obviously this is a very idealistic goal, because you know a completely unique, you said, is a pretty lofty gear, but you'd want it to be a healthy percentage. Maybe you're going to say something like half the tournament should have this experience, and the other half the tournament maybe they're allowed to face the same one more than once, right? Like that could be a reasonable measure. So that's what I went with, right? So if you're going to face 2 big mana decks, you'd rather be 1 Eldrazi and 1 bots. So what I tested is I said, you know what I want to aim for? I want to aim for a 50% chance of facing all unique macro types. That was the goal. I think if you have a 50% chance of having a totally unique tournament experience, but the people who are on the other 50% maybe have a double up, then that's okay. That's the goal, a reasonable goal. So anyway, I'll show you, did the sample thing again. So I did the macro type sampling for the RC. So again, same thing, put all the decks in, put all the decks into the left-hand side, coded them up according to their macro type, took 300 samples, random number generator, converted it into a macro type, counted how many times someone was to face each of the 32 macro types, and then just made a formula which tested was it all unique. And then so we'll see the pass rate here is not 50% for the RC. It's in the 30s consistently. So in my mind, the RC is not passing the macro type test. We'll talk about why that was probably the case in a moment. But with 1 double up allowed, we're more in the 70s, which is more like it. But you know, if I'm going to stick to my methodology of defining the goal before I look at the data, I think that the format was not in a good place macro type wise for the RC. Let's actually look at the RC decks and see why that's likely the case. The reason that was the case is that nearly every aggro deck featured the initiative in like 2 or more cards. Control was pretty split, but mid-range was very much dominated by Grixis, right? So about half of the mid-range decks were Grixis. Combo was pretty spread out. Tempo was pretty spread out, but again, a bias towards Grixis. Big mana, bit of a bias towards bots, but still spread. Synergy spread out. Hybrid combo reasonably spread out, like mostly warp/historical. But the main reason which this measure didn't work the way for the way which I would have defined the format goal is because specifically in aggro and mid-range, there was an over-representation of specifically initiative-based aggro and Grixis-based mid-range, which I feel, again, if you went to this tournament, tell me if that was your experience, because if that rings true to you, maybe I've made a good measure here and the data has confirmed something which rings true with our collective experiences. When I do the POG wall, Henry's asked the question, was the initiative deck a strict cutoff? I did put you in as Red White Legends as an initiative deck, yeah. Okay, so when I go to POG wall, bit of a different story. The pass rate is much closer to 50%. It's kind of going between high 40s, low 50s. And the one double up allowed is passing. So according to this method at least, the POG Winner Library Tournament was a more diverse macro type experience than the RC. And if I look to the coding count here, you'll see that aggro, aggro's really, there's just not as many of them. It is still half initiative, but half is much less than the previous proportions. But in particular, the mid-range is way more spread out than it used to be. Grixis is now more like a third of it, less than half of it. Combo is also spread out into thirds, right, which is pretty relevant here. Yeah, you've just, big mana is all bots, not as much Eldrazi. Although I have seen in some coverage that some of the things I called bots were classified as Eldrazi, so maybe that's a bit better than I thought it was. But basically what we're seeing here is that because there's a lot more difference within the archetypes, that's why the statistic is showing more success. So where does that leave us at the end? I didn't do Canberra for this one just because this process was particularly time consuming to set it all up, and I just didn't have the time. This is already going to be a long video. So macro type diversity, success. Okay, same limitations as before. If you get that strength filtering effect as the tournament drags on, you're more likely to dip below. So maybe there's a little bit more work to be done here on macro types, but I feel like the pointing which was made has made the macro types more diverse than they were. Certainly according to this methodology, that's true. All right, let's keep going. The next thing we're talking about is deck and game diversity, and this is where things get truly tricky to understand. So I'll do my best to make it clear. All right. What I'm going to look at here is the prevalence of individual cards. Because, for example, people could call their decks different things, Grixis, Jund, Reanimator, but if they're all playing Emperor, like Nethergoyf, Emperor of Bones, Barragoyf, the way their opponent is going to remember that matchup and in that game experience is kind of likely to be similar. And they're not like, you know, they might be like, yeah, it was Reanimator, but, you know, it was like this Reanimator, you know, like, so that's why it's relevant to look at the prevalence of individual cards here, because of the repetitive play patterns and games ending for similar reasons. It's much harder to measure, but we could draw a few rough lines. So there are some easy lines to draw. So for example, maybe one goal is that no more than 50% of the decks in the room should contain the same card, or maybe should contain the same threat. Because I feel like there's kind of a cultural acceptance that the, you know, your Ponders, your Swords to Plowshares, your Lightning Bolts, it's okay if everyone's playing them, but because they, you know, they kind of just happen once and it's over, but no one wants every game to be ended by the same Ragavan, for example, right? Which was the case when Ragavan was around, you know, in that, you know, every red deck, control, mid-range, combo, they all played it, because why not? So I'm going to be measuring the prevalence of threats here, and I'm setting 50% as the cutoff, but it could just as easily be 40%. I'm not married to any amount. I'm interested in what the community thinks is an acceptable number here. And then the next one, which is far more complicated, is if a card's strength is higher relative to the field, perhaps that card is overpowered. And that's also important because people look at these spreadsheets and then they change their decks for the next tournament based on the overall performance of cards in the last tournament. So it is important that if these numbers are going to be around and be public knowledge, that people don't get too led down the garden path to homogenize their decks, because the more homogeneity, the less we're fulfilling the mission statement. So let's do the easy measure first, which is literally just like prevalence of cards, right? So in the RC, there is 112 you know, cards, and so any card which shows up, so 112 decks, so any card which shows up more than 56 times is worth looking at. There are definitely spells which do this. In terms of threats, there was one. It was Fable of the Mirror Breaker. The next closest contenders were Fury, Solitude, and Flage. This should probably tell a story, as well as looking at the spells, that this was a red-white tournament, dominated by red-white cards. And so people would have played against a red-white deck a lot, and that would have contributed to a lot of games feeling the same. So, unsurprisingly, Fable got pointed, Flage got pointed as well, you know, but like, so yeah, that kind of might explain some of the not that I presented this to the committee or anything, but this might have, you know, informed some of where those pointing decisions came from. With Pog War, there were 78 decks, so any deck which showed up 39 times is worth looking at. So the spells have changed to take on a far more blue-black texture. Brainstorm, like Mental Misstep again, obviously. Brainstorm, Thoughtseize, Inquisition, Ponder, Cataxian Probe, Lightning Bolt, Mishra's Bauble. Threats. No threat was played more than 50% of the time. So that's a plus, right? That's an improvement. The closest contenders are Tameo coming up at 46%, but let me tell you, this is not necessarily an indicator of strength. And then Barragoyf, Emperor Bones, and Nethergoyf, the black package, each at 33%. But you know what? 33%? That might just be okay. Maybe it's okay if the best black suite of threats shows up 33% of the time. After all, it is mostly a 3-color format. When you get a bit of overlap, black's going to be in a lot of those configurations. So maybe we say that from a prevalence point of view, the pointing did its job. We went from a very overrepresented threat with some close contenders follow-up to one not quite there yet with some quite distant follow-ups at 33%. So according to the measure I set out, pointing did the job, or the format did the job, or whatever. Seems like the Pog Winner Library was doing better from a threat prevalence measure than the RC. Okay, now it goes to power. Let's see if I'm able to explain this properly. So the first thing we need to do is I need to standardize all of the match points into a binomial, which means I can't have win, loss, draw. It is either you won or you didn't win. Okay, which just is binomial. Bi is 2, right? 2 wheels on a bicycle. Win, loss. So I did that. Second thing, I need to find the proportion of wins for each card. Let me actually see if I, do I have handy? I might have handy one of the data sheets, which can help lend a bit of color to this. So where's my normalization question? Normal. Okay, so take every card. I count how many of the wins and losses there are. So hang on. I'll expand and contract as necessary. So I count how many wins and losses there are. So for example, Abdel Adrian there was one deck which got 6 wins with this card, one deck which got 5, one win which got 4, one with 3, one, and then none with 2, 0, 0. So whereas Oculus, this is a much more played card. This is the RC. There are 7 decks which got 5 wins with Oculus, 3 decks which got 4 wins, 5 decks which got 3 wins, etc. So this is just creating a table of values. So after that, you create a proportion of wins for each card. So out of all the games that were played with this card, what proportion of them, so out of all the games that were played with this card, what proportion of them are a win? So that's our P value. You multiply that by the number of cards and you get an NP and an N1 minus P. So these are nothing special which I've made up. This is just a stock standard. If you wanted to determine whether a binomial distribution was normal, you would take both of these figures and check that both of these numbers are larger than 5. So if you do, and then I just have a basic test, are both of these number than 5? If so, say yes. And then I'm going to compare this normal test with the copies of the card and see if there is a pattern across all of our tournaments to show us how many copies of a card you need for the card to be normally distributed. And thankfully, there is a pattern. So when I went through and I checked the normality testing for each of the tournaments, the RC, the POG, Winner Draw, and the Canberra, what we saw is that all of them peter out in yeses at about the same number, and that number is 13. So as you can see here, 14s we got a lot of mostly yeses, 13s we just over half yeses, and then 12 it's very sparse. Right here, 18, 17, 16, and again 13 is where it's petering out, with 12 it's been less than half. Canberra, 14, 13, and again petering out here at 12. What this tells me, and I will continue to test this in future tournaments, is that quite reliably, if we get 13 copies of a card in one of our Magic tournaments, that card's wins are likely normally distributed, and that means that when we say things like the average amount of wins for that card, that is a meaningful measure. When we talk about its Z-score, that's a meaningful measure. Otherwise, the average performance of a card, like a match point average, as I'd like previously kind of talked about, it doesn't really mean anything, because if there's not enough of the card to create a normal distribution, well then the mean could be unfairly skewed by an outlier or something like that. So that's so what I've discovered, just, you know, it was a happy discovery. 13 is the magic number for our data analysis. Another really interesting fact is you guys will almost certainly notice, hey, you know, Ben, what about this, where every now and then there's lots of copies of a card, but it doesn't turn up normally distributed. What's going on there? Every single one of these is a basic land. Every single one. And that's, in my mind, further confirmation that this is a completely valid test, because there's a very good reason why the basic lands should fail this test. Because when you have, for example, 20 islands show up at a tournament, that doesn't mean that there are 20 decks playing islands. That means that there might be 4 decks playing 5 islands apiece. So that 20 for a basic land might actually only be 4 decks, which is less than 13, thus unsurprising that it's not normally distributed. So I was very happy with that discovery. It made me feel like, okay, maybe something I'm doing here is working. Like we have a meaningful and consistent pattern showing up, something I can look at later. All right, so the next thing we do is, now that I've confirmed that 13 is our magic number, and I know now that I just have to only look at the cards which have 13 or more copies in them, I can start to do some null hypothesis testing. Are these cards actually overperforming? So I perform a two-tailed t-test, so Z test. So the reason it's two-tailed is that if you imagine you have a normal distribution, we're interested in the cards which are really sucking at that end and also really overperforming at the other end. So these are the, you know, that's just the null hypothesis test. If you've done stats, you'll know what that means. And then I'm going to rank order my test values, so that the absolute values, so I get a list of all of the cards with the ones which are the most certain to be something fishy going on to the least certain. And whilst and I'll show you what that looks like. Actually, it's probably best explained with a visual aid. So when I then go to my where is it? Where is my not the macro types, not the archetype. It's my Z scores. Okay, so here we go. Here's the result of doing this to the Canberra, to RC, and to Pogwall. So, basically, this p-value. This is like the test statistic. How do I explain this? Most people have heard of something p 0.05. Most people have heard of that as a standard thing. What that means is that if you set a null hypothesis, which is all the cards perform roughly the same, and an alternate hypothesis, some cards perform better than others, the p-value kind of says, of the 0.05 says, if it is actually true, if we assume that some cards perform better than other cards or worse than other cards, there is a 5% chance that that data set was that the data you're looking at was random, that it happened via chance, that it happened randomly. But that 5%, that magic 5% figure, to be clear, normally what you would do if you were doing this kind of thing is you would consult all of the existing literature. You'd read about everyone else who'd ever performed one of these statistical tests. What did they learn? What was the appropriate cutoff? Because for Magic the Gathering data, we don't have an existing literature of people performing these statistical tests. So instead, the method I decided to go with is I did set 5 as a cutoff, as to say this will just tell us if we just use the bog standard figure. And you'll notice in the if you can read the formats, so if you can read the formulas, they don't actually say 0.05, they say 1.19, so 1.96, because that's 2 standard deviations, which leads to 5%, 2.5 at either end. But anyway, so I'm rabbiting on a little bit. I use the 5% figure because it's kind of like the industry standard, but what I'm saying is don't take that as a hard cutoff, because it's not based in any history of literature. It might be for 7-point Highlander data, maybe 10% is the best cutoff. Maybe it's 30%, maybe 1 standard deviation, maybe it's 16% then. Maybe 1 standard deviation is enough for us to care. But nevertheless, what I am confident of is no matter what the magical cutoff is, this is the order of cards we should be looking at, where the ones at the top are the ones overperforming the most or underperforming. You'll see that some of these are negative. And the ones at the bottom are the most balanced, where everything's tending towards balanced. Okay, so let's start looking at some results where we can all get excited. So if we look at Canberra and the RC, so these were under the kind of the same pointing regime. Fable, like Canberra for a start, you'll notice has really high test statistics. So the reason this is the case is because Canberra was a tournament which attracted both in terms of the culture of the Canberra community, the prizing structure which Pat offered, the way the tournament was advertised, and and its location meant that there were way more unique cards played in Canberra and way more unique decks. Like there were just people playing cards which had never been played at a major 7-point tournament for ages. And so what that meant was that the cards which quote unquote overperformed really overperformed, right? So this data would say that the Barragoyf, that's a Fable of the Merrymaker, Barragoyf, Molten Collapse, Marsh Flats, Nevergoyf, Pyrogoyf, Tameo, Badlands, like these cards, definitely not by chance were overperforming the rest of the field. And I think the reason we almost know this to be certainly true is that Canberra is home to Team Bustop, who all took the same Grixis list together and all played these cards and did do better than the field on average. So it kind of makes sense that these cards would show up as overperforming the most, right? Like there are so many contextual factors where if this didn't happen, we'd be scratching our heads saying, how valid is this statistical analysis, right? And under the rest of it, we see all of our just classic good 7-point cards, right? So this is where this is why you get a lot of cards at Canberra which are overperforming or underperforming. It still might be worth noting, are there any underperformers here? Swamp just is because mono black text play multiple of them. Yeah, none of the underperformers were statistically significant, which is just to say that at Canberra, the cards which underperformed were likely in all of the brews, right? All the casual decks. That's what that tells us. So, feature of the tournament, but it makes sense that the data, that the data matches kind of what we would have expected. I think it's a little bit more interesting to look at the RC and Pog War, because when you look at the raw amount of cards played, there were far less cards, and that's just because people's strategies were more homogenized against what was quote unquote good, right? And that's probably a feature of like, you know, the top heavy prize structure, just the culture of these capital cities tends to be a little bit more competitive. So, you know, that's just, yeah, that's why we, you know, maybe this is a little bit more of a good like for like comparison. But, you know, look, I'd say this, props to Canberra for really embodying the spirit of the format, right? Like, it brought us the most diverse set of cards and decks played, but where you were really rewarded for good deck building and good plays. So now let's look at RC and Pogwall, what's overperforming, what's underperforming. So the lands might give you a little bit of idea of the color, of the colors which are succeeding and not succeeding, right? Like Tropical Island Underground Sea, that kind of like, you know, blue-based is doing quite well. Hallowed Fountain here doing very badly, right? So Hallowed Fountain mostly played by like kind of Jeskai or Blue-White control decks, really not doing well. Deathrite Shaman doing very well. Mana Drain doing very badly. And just to make a point here, like, I played Mana Drain at this tournament and I came second, like, but it's quite clear that the average Mana Drain deck did not have a good time at this tournament from a wins perspective. Dismember doing very well. I gotta say, Dismember is one of those cards which it actually shows up also in Pog and also in Canberra. It might be the case that actually players who have identified that Dismember is not just a black card, but maybe just a good colors removal card, are getting an edge. Animate Dead doing quite well. Snapcaster Mage doing badly. And again, this kind of makes sense, right? Snapcaster Mage, Mana Drain, Hallowed Fountain, all from the same deck, not performing very well. And there you can see here, Barragwave Molten Collapse, part of that, you know, red-black. Headliner Scarlet doing well, Inquisition doing well, Steam Vents doing badly, kind of fitting in with our, you know, control having a hard time, you know, set of data here. And that's going to be reflected over in POG as well. Counterspell still doing badly. What are the like Tameo, also a card which shows up in a lot of control decks, not doing as very well. Like, yeah, there's Watery Grave. This is a bit surprising because a lot of decks play Watery Grave, but a lot of, you know, mid-range decks and combo decks do as well. But overall, I can say from the RC, one of the takeaways is the control is doing not well, and black-based mid-range seems to be doing well. And also, it appears that red is doing, like, black-based mid-range tends to be overperforming. After this point, not much point in looking here. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. There is less and less point worth looking here. As I said before, 0.5 might not be the magical cutoff. Like these cards, for example, are still quite close to, if you were to convert these into like a percentile score from a normal score, these would still be quite close to the 5%. But when we get down here, these are data points we should ignore. They are tending towards balance, for what it's worth. You will see, hopefully, that after the pointing, the amount of balance increased, right? There are less clear over and underperformers, right? There are still some, but there are less of them. We could, of course, look a little bit further down. 1.98, these are still good test statistics, but the time we get to 1.7 from here on onwards, this is like I would say, more firmly ignore. But what do we learn here? Pyroglyph, doing really well. Was also, I think if you look up Pyroglyph, it actually does well across most of them. Whoops, I've left an R out. Oh my god, for some reason this thing won't let me type. Pyroglyph. Boom. Pyroglyph. Oh, maybe there weren't enough... no, it's because it's searching within this thing. There we go. Pyroglyph doing well in Canberra, doing well in Pogwall. Not statistically significant in the RC. Okay, so you could of course look through and generate stories about all these things. What strikes me, I think, as the interesting things to look at is that the control cards are consistently not doing well. There are some cards which culturally have been talked about as doing really well, like Tameo. Not that data doesn't support that conclusion. Abhorrent Oculus also got a lot of hype after Canberra. Data doesn't support that that's a consistent pattern. And there are some cards which I don't think are talked about as much, like Pyroglyph and Dismember, which are consistently doing well. That doesn't, so that doesn't mean that we should point these cards or anything. And it doesn't even mean that these cards are necessarily doing well, because you've got to remember, as one of the limitations for this method, just because the card is in the deck doesn't mean it was drawn in every game. But the fact that the decks which play this card are normally distributed does mean that there is something going on here we can talk about. Perhaps what it means is that decks which play this card are getting a bit of an edge. right? So that doesn't mean it's going to go in every deck. Maybe there are some decks which are more fitting for it than others, but it would be worth considering. Like, you know, for example, I play a lot of control decks which are like Jeskai. I'm going to consider playing Dismember in it. Maybe that card I've been, you know, ignoring it unfairly, and maybe there are some decks we should consider playing Pyroglyph. Who knows? Or maybe Tamiyo instead of. I know that there's a lot of them being played. Maybe people should reconsider whether it actually fits their deck strategy. That's just questions to be asked. But anyway, that's the end result of all of my data there. So what have I learned? I feel like what I've learned is that the pointing succeeded in making a deck where cards are not as overrepresented in power than other cards, because, you know, the committee looked. We didn't look at this data. We were obviously going off our knowledge of the format. But there are less statistically significant overperformers in POG than there were the RC. That might also just be a feature of the ones in Sydney, ones in Melbourne. I'll be really interesting to look at CamCon and see if this picks it up. But yeah, let's keep going with the PowerPoint. I do want to. Stephen said something in the chat which I definitely want to talk about as part of my further thoughts. So yeah. Anyway, where do we go from here? I mean, so as far as I'm concerned, like in terms of assessing the three forms of diversity, I think the format is consistently doing well on archetype diversity. I think we have made a marked improvement post-pointing on macrotype diversity, and on individual card performance, those metrics have increased before, which is just to say my conclusion at the end of this would be, according to my 3 predefined measures, the format is better now post-pointing than before the pointing. Mission accomplished, committee. Hats off to you guys. Great team. All right. Things needed to make the statistical analysis better. Okay, so the first thing is that people who drop pollute the data because it creates more 0 or 1 wins than there would otherwise be, which skews the standard deviation, and it also gives cards more 0 wins than they would otherwise deserve. So, like, obviously, you know, all data set has limitations, all studies have attrition rates, people who drop out. Like, this is not a thing which is a magic only problem, but you know, one solution could be collect who drops and exclude their data, or ban dropping or something. I don't know. But like, if I knew which decks dropped out, that would make for better data. Second, people who intentionally draw at the end pollute the data for the same reason, because it limits the amount of 6 and 7 wins that a card might otherwise achieve, and it makes it kind of means that, ironically, the second tier of cards might overperform the top tier, because like, the top tier go 502, and then the second tier bash to do the winning in 6-1. So that, you know, group of decks kind of get more wins. So I don't know, can we ban IDing? Or maybe I should only be looking at the first 5 rounds, not all 7. There's some ideas here, but I'm saying IDs create problems for the data. Or maybe even it would be helpful if the people who ID kind of have a game anyway, and then just tell me who wins or something. I don't know. But IDs pollute the data. Again, it's not like a 7-point only feature. It's a thing, but I'm acknowledging its limitation. The last one is that 2-0 is not the same as 2-1. Like, a deck that gets truly rinsed, it wasn't able to win a game, is definitely weaker than a deck which is able to put 1 win against the board against an opponent. And there are some decks where this is almost a feature, like combo and bots and stuff, like easily hateable decks, are definitely still strong, because almost guaranteeing 1 win in game 1 is part of the strength of the deck. So yeah, so anyway, what that means, right, is that you know, maybe if we collected individual game wins rather than match wins, I would have a better sense of the relative strength of cards. I don't think that any of these things are going to completely change the picture of the data and the conclusions which I made before, but it would, for the sake of making a more robust statistical test. Those would be my preferences. I don't know if it's possible at the end of these tournaments to export individual game wins, not just match wins, but if I could do that, I would use them next time. Further thoughts. What do we do about cards of lower sample sizes? Well, one, there are other statistical tests you can do, like t-tests. Obviously, I kind of foresaw with the amount of content I generated that this would be a very long video, and I was also getting very tired, and I did this over like the course of a week, so I didn't have the appetite to do a t-test on every other card, but in theory, in a different video, that might be possible. The other thing as well is that maybe presence is more important than strength. Like, you know, even if you had a low power card that was doing hang on. Even if you had a card which was in very low prevalence but wasn't being played by lots of people, maybe it's like okay that card flies under the radar. Maybe that person, maybe that person deserves a bit of the unidentified power that they have uniquely gotten. And the last thing is maybe less knowledge is better. So like one of the things Stephen has said in the comments, right, is that there's a kind of a cascading factor where people look at the previous tournament and then change their deck based on those results. So I'm not sure if necessarily I want to do this again, because if, for example, I learned that 100 people who went to Canberra looked at this video and every single one of them included Dismember in their deck, and that actually was an advantage, essentially what I've done is I've homogenized the format, rightly or wrongly, and I just don't think it's settled philosophically whether that's a good thing. Maybe it would be better if we were in the dark, from a format balance perspective, or maybe, you know what, the content this generates is better. It gets people more excited. I don't know. I just don't think it's settled science that if we did all the relevant statistical tests and we got really good at this, that would necessarily be better. The second thing is, could we apply the overperformance method to archetype or macro type performance? To check if the archetypes or macro types are overperforming. And I actually did do this, because I had the spreadsheet set up. And the problem is that too many of the archetypes and macro types don't have enough players to make statistically valid to get the binomial to happen. And then of the ones which do, none of them are significant. So I did try do a statistical test for archetype and macro type performance, but there's just not enough data, unfortunately. I need a much bigger tournament. And the last thing is this like kind of the be all and end all of decision making for the committee? Absolutely not. This might be something which raises discussion. Like certainly after this, I'm going to be putting Pyroglyph on the discuss category, but that doesn't mean that Pyroglyph is the problem. Maybe the problem is mid-range red or something. I don't know. So just like, which is just to say, when this whole thing comes out, it would be irresponsible to think, well, I know what Mouse is going to be advocating for now. It's every card at the top of the list. That is absolutely not the case. We're not going to say, D-point manage range just because Control's doing badly. We might be thinking about, well, mate, what can we do to help Control? Is there a different Control card to D-point? There is still always going to be a role for the actual knowledgeable player and committee member, not just doing these statistical tests. So in conclusion, statistics are only good as the reality they seek to describe. Please use this to start a conversation. What I would like to know is, do you think that the conclusions which these tests have come up with match your experience? Is it the case that the format does feel good from an archetype perspective, but maybe but maybe the macro types are a little homogenous in the RC and less homogenous in POG Winner Game, Winner Library? What was that actually? Was that a thing? Are the cards which I say are the over and under performers, do they feel like that, or maybe they don't? I know a lot of people feel like Tamiyo is really powerful, but by the data, the decks which contain Tamiyo are not actually overperforming, they're underperforming. So have a think, move forward as you play your games, ask yourself, does this actually match reality? Does it match the experience? And if you've got any ideas, let me know. I made a bunch of a priori assumptions here. I said 50% was a cutoff for prevalence. I said things like, that we want half the players to have a totally unique deck, but maybe that was asking too much. Maybe it's okay if 40% have experience all different matchups. I said that for archetypes that it was okay if someone faced the same archetype 3 out of 7, but not okay if it was 4 out of 7. Maybe you have a different opinion. Maybe you think actually 2 out of 7 is the max and 3 out of 7 is too much. So start a conversation. What should our goals for format health be? Because now that I've got this, it's just a matter of changing the formula. And is this level of depth even necessary? Like, are you thinking, God, it's been an hour and he's still talking. What more could he possibly have to say? Or maybe you're thinking, this is what I've been waiting for all this time, I don't know. Just tell me what you think, because this is a big time investment for me. It's not something I'm likely to do after every tournament, maybe once in every 3 tournaments or something. But if you like it and you want to see more, please react to the video when I finally post it or whatever. And yeah, so I can get the feedback. All right, that's it. Signing off. Thank you everyone for listening. That was the Mouse's data deep dive into 7-point Highlander over the last 3 major tournaments. Did the pointing help? Conclusion, yes. Thank you. Bye-bye.